Hello and welcome to I Missed Book Club. I'm Veronica Reynolds, Head of Community Relations at New City Library, and with me is my co-host,
Joe Barbieri from the Reference Department at New City Library.
And our local history librarian, most importantly, especially because today we're diving into this deep historical record and asking, who was William Shakespeare? Joe, do you know why we ask this question?
Well, if I remember correctly from high school, there is a little bit of doubt about whether or not he did all the work that he did that he's credited with. And I think that's kind of a fun thing to play with. So, yeah, let's learn about the history. I think you're going to be our guide, and I'll kind of go along for the ride with some color commentary.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about Shakespeare is that you may not realize this, but it was 500 years ago.
I guess when you sit down and think about it, it was 500 years ago, yeah.
So as a local history person, what can you tell us what happens to the historical record when it's been about 500 years?
Well, things get murky. There's things that are stories that kind of get added to the canon. Sometimes there are long-standing beliefs that just become part of the canon because, well, it's been written down a long time ago and we don't have anything further to go back on, so that's the oldest thing we've got. So yeah, there can be some doubt in play in here.
And how good were the historical records 500 years ago?
Well, we're not documenting. No one is going out and getting their driver's license made up at the DMV, so we don't have a lot of vitals, things like as we would know them today, basically.
Right. If we get lucky, there's like a family Bible or a local church that's recorded a birth or a death. So in the case of Shakespeare's father, because, I love to start with the parents, he enters the record in 1552, at which time he was probably in his 30s. And would you like to guess why the father of the bard enters into the historical record in his 30s?
Maybe my guess is like a tax or a census record.
That would be nice. No, he allowed garbage to build up in front of his house and he got fined.
Oh, so okay. So there we go. So kind of granted it's probably pretty light, but a criminal record.
Yeah, he gets a misdemeanor. So he was a glover, but he was a very accomplished glover. He made enough money that he was able to begin to acquire property, including a house in 1556. So we have the deed for the house. And that's where William Shakespeare would be born. But John lives a very colorful life. He has lots of occupations. You see in court documents that he was also an ale taster, which was an official
There's
thing.
A good job.
Well, you couldn't drink water, right? At the time, water was a bad idea because the Thames was disgusting, and so were most water supplies. So a lot of people drank watered down beer, small beer, right, for breakfast. So being an official ale taster was not isn't this a fun job? It was to make sure that people weren't poisoning stuff or cheapening it by overwatering it. But that role led to being chamberlain, constable, alderman, and eventually high bailiff, which was something like a mayor by 1568. So John's star rises over time. But in the 1570s, there are some money troubles. And by 1578, he's exempted from paying taxes because he's poor enough to get an amnesty.
Oh, wow.
But at some point between then and 1596, he must turn the business around again because he receives a coat of arms, which means you've become quite successful. They were really sought after. You did have to pay for them. And at the time, they could have cost as much as £20, which is a huge sum at that point. There's a record of lawsuits and money issues that does seem to die off as John reaches the end of his life. So what we can guess is that he kind of had this period of bankruptcy essentially, but does manage to turn it around. Shakespeare's mother was likely born between 1536 and 38, and she's the youngest of 8 daughters. Her father was a very respected landowner. He left her a lot of money upon his death. Obviously, we have all girls, so she can inherit. And it's very likely that when he died, married John, she was between the ages of 19 to 21. Because what do we know about the supposed youth marriages of the middle and late Renaissance period?
Well, they're not youth marriages because you're in the middle of your life, probably, right? I mean, you're not going to. Most people are not going to live well into their 70s or 80s. That's closer to the middle of your life than the beginning.
That's true. I just also want to clarify, though, that for most people, in what we would consider the middle classes, they weren't getting married at 14. Oh. I think there's this feeling that people get married at 12 or 13, and that
those are like arranged nobility. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's yeah.
So 19 to 21 was a pretty average age to get
Yep.
married, which it was even in America at the turn of the last century. So she is named the executive of her father's will, so it's very likely that she was literate, which is pretty cool. The couple winds up having 8 children. The first 2 daughters are born before William die in infancy, making him the oldest child, even though he's the 3rd birth. They have another daughter who dies in childhood. Unfortunately, a very typical story. His brother Gilbert becomes a haberdasher. So we got a hatter.
Yeah.
He works in London. He comes home occasionally to Stratford, but he dies a bachelor at 46. Joan marries a hatter.
Oh, okay. So
We got gloves and hats everywhere.
gloves and hats. We're well dressed.
She has 2 surviving children and lives in one of William's houses until her death at 77. So some
She
people,
did make it far. Okay,
She did.
Good for her.
Richard, who was mostly undocumented and never appeared to leave the family home, dies at 39. And Edmund, who is 16 years younger than William, went to London to become an actor, but he also died young at 29. So Joan is the only one besides William to have surviving children. So the family line, despite having 8 kids, is cut pretty short. But we're not concerned about any of them today. We're concerned about our guy, Billy Shakes.
Yeah.
And he's baptized on April 26th, 1564. Most people celebrate his birthday on April 23rd, but we don't really know the exact date. But if you want to go to a cool festival, Stratford-on-Avon has a big festival on April 23rd, to my knowledge. Yeah.
Cool.
He was likely educated at home and then attended a close-by grammar school.
Okay.
So one of the things that comes up a lot was like, how could this uneducated peasant write these plays? But of course, most people were educated at home to some extent in their early years. And the grammar school that he likely went to didn't keep records of anybody. But it was like right down the street from his house at the time that he would have been the right age. His father had enough money to send him. It was pretty likely he did go to school.
Okay.
And if he did, Latin was a required subject because, of course, most books were in Latin, right? And the students were encouraged to speak Latin to each other on the playground.
Oh, yeah. Just like kids want to do all the time.
Right, exactly. Like, this is just the life, right? There's no record of him attending university, but very few of his contemporaries did, except for one important one. What contemporary of Shakespeare do you think went to college?
You got me stumped.
Christopher Marlowe,
Oh,
otherwise known
okay.
as Kit Marlowe. So Marlowe shows up as a kind of foil to Shakespeare pretty frequently because they were very similarly careered around the same time. So Kit Marlowe is often like the Christina Aguilera to his Britney Spears,
Okay.
if you will.
Yeah. No, that's
For an equally dated
Yeah.
reference. What do you know about Shakespeare's wife?
Oh, she was in that Princess Diaries movie.
Hathaway, that's right.
Yeah.
You're
I think she was a little bit older,
Mhm.
which would have happened. Not too much. Just basically what we had covered. She came from not poor, not noble family, but I guess as close as we could say to upper middle class.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
So she was 26 and Shakespeare was 18, which was, by the way, again, the reason I bring up the child marriage thing, 18 was considered underage. So he needed to get special permission from her father to marry her because he was like not considered a legal age to get married. So they had to get like a special dispensation from Anne's father to get married. And she was already pregnant with her first child when they got married. So if you think that that's a relatively new phenomenon, it's not. But yeah, he was 8 years younger than her, which like at 18 is pretty significant. She was the older woman. They were trying to avoid scandal, so they sped up the proceedings for marriage because there was an application process.
Yeah.
They applied to the bishop's court in Worcester that allowed them to marry in another parish. So the people of their parish wouldn't know that.
Yeah, so they're a little bit further away, and yeah, the faster you do it, the less time people have to sit and count on their fingers the number of months after the kid is born.
One of the big questions that often comes up is, did he love Anne? But of course, we barely have documentation of his life, so we certainly don't know what the inner workings of his heart were about his wife. One of the things that comes up a lot, because one of the documents I'll refer to a lot, because it's one of the few things that we like really solidly have, is Shakespeare's will. And it's considered this like big slight because the only thing he leaves Anne in his will is their second best bed. But the second bed was actually for guests, and the second best would have been their marriage bed. So he was leaving her their bed, and furniture was pretty expensive. And the thought is that It's also possible that it was just assumed she would get part of his fortune and that he didn't have to outline that in his will. So the bed wasn't a slight. It was like, oh, by the way, in addition to everything else she gets, please make sure she gets to keep our marriage bed.
Okay.
Which
so,
seems like pretty legit to me,
Yeah.
but like I also understand if you're just reading that with no context, it's like, wow, real dude. Were there other women or men? Speculation has raged, especially given the content of his sonnets. Although it was very traditional to write sonnets to beautiful boys and to lovely women, that was kind of a given. But no evidence remains of an affair because no evidence remains of very much at all, period.
Okay.
So the couple have 3 children, which we do know about. These were all documented. They have Susanna, who was born in May 1583, then the twins Hamnet and Judith in early 1585. Susanna would marry a physician, which every parent wants, right? She
Yeah.
marries a doctor. It seems likely she was literate and was most likely the executor of Shakespeare's estate, much like his own mother. And she likely inherited his papers, and they think she may even have had a hand in the creation of the first folio. So Susanna's like his child who actually winds up being the most involved in his career, to our knowledge. Judith doesn't get married until she's in her 30s. From the will, she winds up inheriting 150 pounds and a silver bowl, which is much less than her sister gets. Hamnet dies at the age of 11. The cause of death wasn't commonly recorded at the time, but there was plague happening. But I mean, an 11-year-old could die of
Any number
anything.
of maladies then, yeah.
Yeah. But they think his death impacted Shakespeare greatly. And of course, we know he went on to write Hamlet not long after the loss of his son. There would be 4 grandchildren, but none of those grandchildren had heirs themselves. So the nearest living descendants of Shakespeare are through his sister Joan's line. So if you want to find a modern Shakespeare descendant, they're his sister's children.
Okay.
All right. So then we have an interesting gap in the record. So much like other very famous people, we have lost years of Shakespeare. So between the birth of his twins in 1585 and his apparent arrival in the London theatre scene in 1592, we have no idea what happens to him. So there's just 7 years that are just gone. This is what happens, right? 500-year-old record. And of course, I think it's important to emphasize at the time, no one knew Shakespeare was going to be Shakespeare.
Yeah.
No paparazzi were following him around like, this guy's going to be amazing. Write everything down. So there's tons of theories. The closest thing to a contemporary we have, which is still like several years away from his life, thought he was a school teacher during this time, which like if he was literate and educated wouldn't have been crazy.
Yeah, that's a reasonable guess.
No one's really sure why he got up and left for London. Most of his financial investments would continue to be in Stratford-upon-Avon, like the houses that he inherits from his father. And he continues to support his wife and children as far as we can tell. There are some evidence of his lodging, which suggests he continues to return home regularly, despite it being a 3-day commute. So, Joe, you have a long commute to get home to see your kid.
Yeah, 3 days is, that's,
How
that's
often
a real
how often would you go home if you had a 3-day commute?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's got to be rough. But, if the family is important, then you're going to do it.
But there is evidence that he went home pretty regularly. So he didn't abandon this family in Stratford, which I think is kind of bandied about sometimes. I mean, I don't think he was there frequently, but I do think he did see his kids. So by 1592, we know that Shakespeare has established himself as a playwright in London because he writes his early works, including the historical cycle of the Henrys, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and one of my personal favorites, Titus Andronicus, which feel like very early career moves. We got a really long history. We've got a comedy, and we have the bloodiest play he's going to write. His first real printed works were 2 long poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucretia, 1593 and 1594 respectively. They're both dedicated to, I'm going to butcher this name, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, who at the time was his patron. So what can you tell us about like the patronage system that was going on?
Well, for the arts at this time, as an artist, I'm a lot like today until you start really selling your works and becoming a huge, huge thing that you're in demand and people want you to work for them, and you're dependent on these rich folks who, well, they have houses and land and they want to spruce it up with art and be entertained, so you're working for a rich person and basically taking commissions from them.
Right, exactly. And that can really change what you write about, which we'll see throughout Shakespeare's career. And I think it's an important thing to remember because I think it is great art. It's not damaged by having a patron, but it does mean you're going to write about certain things. So I don't think we've done Chaucer yet, but I did do a lecture on Chaucer. And what's really fascinating with Chaucer is that he writes a lot of his more serious works for his patron. And it seemed like he really respected his patron, it was John of Gaunt. And when John of Gaunt's wife passed away, it was Blanche. It was well known that he was like very in love with her. And he writes this really beautiful poem about John of Gaunt's mourning. And it's probably one of his most serious pieces of work. But obviously that's very different from the tone of what Chaucer normally writes. So you can see that a patron can heavily influence what they're writing about. Well, there's a bout of plague happening at this time. And once it ends, he teams up with other actors and they form a new company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men under the Lord Chamberlain's patronage. And the lead actor was Richard Burbage, and he would be the first actor to play many of Shakespeare's famous roles. So Burbage is one of those names that still comes down to us from the same time period because I believe he was the first Hamlet and the first Lear. I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure he was the first Lear for sure. As a member of the troupe, Shakespeare received a portion of the profits. It's likely at this point he was acting as well as maybe starting to write some of the plays.
Okay, the player coach, right?
Yeah, exactly. He's like on stage. Because again, this was like kind of, a small band of men, right?
Yeah.
No female actresses. If you had female parts, it was a young boy, because to be on stage as a woman was considered to be a sex worker, right? So, but he was successful enough that he does purchase a property back in Stratford, which he called the New House.
Makes sense.
Yeah, which I believe is still standing. I'm trying to remember which ones are and aren't. So for almost 20 years, Shakespeare is the main dramatist for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, creating 2 plays a year on average. The group would eventually become the King's Men when James I was crowned and became their patron. I usually bring this up when I talk about Macbeth specifically, because Macbeth is the first play that Shakespeare writes under James I's patronage. Do you know anything about King James I? Off the top of your head?
No.
Really quizzing you.
Nope. They all run together.
So handy fun facts here is that James I was the great witch hunter.
Oh, okay.
So James was extremely terrified of witches specifically. He thought that they were plaguing him all the time. And he also had a notoriously short attention span. So Macbeth is the first play that he writes for under James I's patronage. Remember I told you it impacts it?
Yeah.
Macbeth is the shortest of Shakespeare's plays.
Makes sense.
And it's primarily about witches.
Yeah. I was going to say, that one's got maybe some of the most famous witches in the arts, maybe other than that one from the West in The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, exactly. He's doing pretty well. We're most of this is known just from like kind of stuff around it. We're not getting statements that are like Shakespeare wrote this play at this time, right? But we can kind of infer it from the historical record. He has many patrons over the years, including Queen Elizabeth and William Herbert III, and his brother Philip, to whom the first folio is dedicated. We know that he kind of semi-retires from London around 1610, and that he dies on April 23rd, 1616, at the age of 46. We don't know what kills him, but again, very little is known about what's killing anybody. His will is 3 pages long, and this is the document that everybody mines for information about his life. It was written a few months before his death, and a lot of people think he was already pretty sick. He leaves all his clothing to his daughter Judith. So it's important to point out this time, this is not like your Forever 21 paper thin t-shirt that tears after 2 seconds. Yeah. Clothes were incredibly expensive, right? Especially if he had dyed clothing, which I would assume is like a pretty well-to-do guy. He might have had stuff that was like really richly dyed. So Judith could probably sell his clothing for a great deal of money, not because it was worn by a famous person at auction,
but just because
garments
were expensive.
Yeah, really expensive. The will is revised at some point before his death, probably to reflect that Judith had gotten married and to give her portion of the estate some protection for her from her husband.
Okay.
All right. So here's where things start to get really interesting. Not that his life wasn't interesting, but that's really like what I just told you. Even some of that is supposition. That's like the most we know for sure about Will. What happens after that is that 2 of his friends decide to publish his works. So this is how we start to get the first folio. John Heminid, I used to look that up, and Henry Condell, they were both in the King's Men with him. They wrote they did it only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive as was our Shakespeare by humble offer of his plays. So right now, writing the first folio, we have people saying explicitly, there's a guy named Shakespeare and he wrote these plays and we knew him personally. Okay. So it's actually titled Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. I'm going to put you on the spot again. Do you know why it's called a folio?
Is that the size of the paper that it's on?
Yes. So if it's smaller, it's a quarto, meaning it's a quarter of a size of paper, but a folio is like a big full piece of paper. So there was quite large, because as you can imagine, this guy wrote a lot of plays.
Yeah.
So many of his plays had already been printed in quartos, but they were unbound. And once someone was done with them, they would reuse the paper. This is why if you've ever talked to an archaeologist or a historian, one of the things they love is garbage pits, because they would take things like books and that were unbound. They would like wrap French fries in these papers and then discard them. So they have found some of these pages of quartos and middens and stuff. Ben Jonson, who is himself a famous playwright and a friend of Shakespeare, writes the introductory poem to the first folio. So this interesting thing happens with proofreading at this time. So what do you know about like early publishing?
Well, it's more of a scattershot enterprise than it would be today. I feel like people aren't caring about, spelling or standardization. They're probably going in and doing little touch-ups to the text here and there. Not a formal process like we'd have today with a lot of proofreading or... I picture it as we're taking some liberties here and there. We're going to touch this up a teeny bit in spots too.
So you're absolutely correct. And it's even worse than that.
Oh.
The folio is being proofread partially during the printing. So different books of the same edition have different errors in them. So they're literally like printing a copy, finding errors, selling that copy, and then like fixing it. So we have several first folios surviving, and like they have different errors in them.
Oh, wow.
So they made about 750 copies. And they were sold for about £1, or what's now about $188 in modern currency. So they were really expensive. Books were extremely expensive to make still at this time. But also it would have been a huge book. So it was expensive enough to make a regular book. But if you've ever held a copy, not obviously of like the actual first folio, but like, a modernized copy of the first folio, it's like a big book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And the print's pretty small and it's still pretty hefty. But of the 750 copies that they made, 235 survive.
Wow, that's pretty impressive, actually. But I think that speaks to the fact that these were special items, special things that, might have been put on a shelf, cracked every once in a while. But yeah, these were, like you said, expensive, special things.
Yeah, and I think they were probably put on the shelves of a lot of lords and ladies kind of libraries, places that were not being as easily consumed by fire.
Yeah.
One could assume, if the big stone house, you might have a little more luck than if you were in a thatched cottage. And if you were in a thatched cottage, you were not buying.
No, you weren't buying that in the first place anyway. So.
Right. So just to give you an idea, they were sold for the equivalent of $188. And in 2022, Mills College auctioned their copy off for a cool $10 million.
I believe it because, you look at early book auctions, and this is not only a relatively early piece, but it's also arguably the most famous writer in the English language, so it makes sense.
So all that being said, so that's the historical record, right? We have the first folio from his contemporaries and everything else. Here's the interesting thing. The debate about the authorship of Shakespeare's plays doesn't start until a few decades after he's gone. So there's no contemporary argument about who wrote Shakespeare's plays that we have record of. No one at the time is writing newspaper headlines like, Shakespeare who?
Yeah.
Now, granted, they might have been doing that and we don't have any record of it, but the historical record of this debate, he's been gone for some time. Long enough that there's probably not really anybody to interview. You're starting to run out of first-person sources, right? And I will also say this right away, even though I know it makes some people annoyed, but the majority of Shakespeare scholars believe that Shakespeare wrote the works that are attributed to him. That is the prevailing argument in scholarship. I'm going to say that right at the top.
We'll get that out.
Yeah, get it out of the way because people are, I'm going to say a lot of stuff, but the minority is the dissenting point. Now, if you want to believe the minority, that's totally fine. Sometimes the minority is correct, but most Shakespearean scholars think a man named William Shakespeare existed and wrote these plays. And the first major point of evidence that's pointed to is that his name appears on the works as the author, which understandably is a pretty good piece of evidence. He's also been recorded as an actor in plays that bear his name, so we know he was there. On at least 6 legal documents, he's recognized as part of the company or one of the fellows.
Okay.
But they don't distinguish one from the other all the time, so it's hard to say from that. And it's evident from his will that William Shakespeare of Stratford-on-Avon is the one who owned a share of the Globe and performed with his fellows. So we know the guy who wrote the will is the guy who performed and lived in London. So there's no dissent about that. Many of his contemporaries call him a playwright.
Okay, so that's fair.
Which helps.
Yeah.
Sometime before 1623, a statue is erected in his memory that depicted him as a writer. It's often brought up as evidence that he wasn't an author, as it's possible that the pen and paper in his hand were added later. But no one debates that the description compares him to Virgil, and reference is made to all that is written.
Okay.
So some of this misunderstanding comes from an etching that was done incorrectly. It's like very minutia stuff, and you can look into it further if anybody's interested. A lot of this monument is some of what's caused some dissent over the years. So if you're interested, that's like a key point. Most importantly, there is no evidence that anyone in the Elizabethan or Jacobean era doubted that Shakespeare had written the plays. His contemporaries are not recorded as challenging this idea, and the earliest recorded doubter was in 1785. So actually more than a few decades.
Way later.
Yeah, so again, there's no contemporaries left to interview at this point.
Yeah.
But there is this question, so why is there a question? Doubt of his authorship usually points to a possible lack of education, or in earlier debates like the 1780s, his ill breeding.
Okay.
So we're already starting to see that a root of this early disagreement might be classism.
Yeah.
Another point is that in his will, he didn't bequeath a library. So people say, well, he didn't have any books to give, so how could he have been a writer? Education at the time is definitely more dependent on learning by rote, which we don't really do anymore, but was common through the 1900s. And it's likely that a lot of prominent writers didn't actually own books. We also don't know if he left stuff behind in London. Unclear, but okay. The idea that he didn't write the plays doesn't even really take off until 1857. 2 scholars write 2 separate books claiming the plays have been written by Sir Francis Bacon. He's our number 1 alternate person. You'll notice, very importantly, he has Sir in his name.
Yeah.
Right? And then we get this big problem, which is that celebrities of the time pick up this theory. Does this sound familiar to you, to modern day stuff?
Yeah. I mean, this sounds like how any conspiracy theory could be picked up on today and run with.
All right, so you ready for this list of names of people who spread this rumor?
Sure.
Oscar Wilde.
Okay.
Mark Twain.
Okay.
Sigmund Freud.
All right.
Helen Keller.
All right, so there we go. Big literary and socially active people of the day, picking that up and running with it makes sense.
So it's important to note, so there's a lot of people floated as potential Shakespeare people. Aside from Bacon, which referring to him that way sounds really callous, aside from Sir Francis Bacon, almost all the major candidates believed to have written the plays were dead before the last of them had been written. Slightly inconvenient in the timing there.
Yeah.
I'm sure that if you're a proponent of them, you have a reason, but I'm just noting that now. His contemporaries, by the way, compared him to his friend Ben Jonson, who, again, was a playwright. So that's also something that came up. So who was Shakespeare? So Patrick Cheney, who's the Distinguished Professor of English and Comparative Literature, I didn't note down in the university for some reason, my apologies, Dr. Cheney, said that there's actually more difficult to answer questions about Shakespeare than who he was, like who wrote the plays. One of their big questions was he a consummate businessman concerned only with commercial success because of his acting company, or was he also a literary poet playwright who cared about preserving his artistic legacy? What kind of man was he? Was the love he described in his sonnets and on stage rooted in his personal life, or did he have political intentions with his writing? So those are kind of the bigger questions about Shakespeare. So rather than going into all these potential candidates, because there's many, like I said, Sir Francis Bacon's the big one, but people have floated everyone from the Queen herself down to Kit Marlowe has been suggested at one point. He and Kit probably did collaborate at one point, but Kit's killed in a bar fight long before Shakespeare dies. It's pretty tragic, actually. Some say that he was staged that death and came and was to get out of debt.
Oh, wow.
Which is fun.
That's fun
if true, but was unlikely. But having told you all of this, Joe, how do you feel?
I understand where the doubt comes from, especially, I think it's just because the sheer number of things, what we would call hits, for lack of a better term, right? How did one guy churn out all of these? How did he have the time to churn out? But and maybe I also understand, well, someone from this quote unquote lowly station in life who was not didn't come from the best family and wasn't a person of didn't come from a family that would people of leisure and would have the free time to do this. But even in our own lives and experiences, we've seen this. How many of those Renaissance artists were orphans or didn't come from families who were necessarily noble or had a lot of free time and money and energy? Yeah, a certain chunk of them did, but there were plenty that were from regular old families, had the talent and succeeded. And I think you could say, well, how, and for the output, I mean, even like a doubter like Mark Twain, he had a bunch of hits over a span of years. If you wanted like a more contemporary example, I would say, someone might look back and say, how did these four guys come up with write all these songs in 4 years? Mm-hmm. And so many of them were hits that went around the world and, they filled stadiums. And how did they do that in such a short span of time? So people can be famous and big in their day, and they can do it.
Can I float one
Sure.
of my little theories
Go
as
ahead.
well? I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think output is, we know James Patterson's writing bestsellers every 28 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, he has help, but actually a more contemporary version too is Nora Roberts, who doesn't have ghostwriters and writes under two names, right?
Yeah.
She's Nora Roberts and J.D. Robb.
Yep.
She writes all of those books.
Yeah.
She does not have ghostwriters, and she pounds those out, and people love her books.
Yeah.
So it is totally possible to produce quite a lot. I think there's an interesting thing that happens with language. So as you know, that's one of my big pet interests. We did the history of English language one. And what's happening around Shakespeare's time is really interesting, because when we talk about the history of the English language, we're talking about the slow death of having a formal second language in England, right? So I don't know if you remember, but we were talking about around Chaucer's age, English starts to become the predominant language of even the wealthy in England, because previous to that, it had been French. We're now 200 years later down the line from Chaucer, and now everybody pretty much speaks English, even though Latin is considered like the language of the educated. But I think Shakespeare is the first time we see people adopt the language as beautiful. Like English is kind of considered this lowly, pigeony kind of language, and Shakespeare really starts to make it the language of poetry, right? I mean, that is the turning point in the historical record. I don't think his contemporaries were like, this is changing everything. Yeah. I think if we look back, it's one of the reasons that we attach to Shakespeare so strongly is the beautiful language. However, I think it's important to note that when he's writing, a lot of his humor is written for the working class.
Oh, yeah. I remember that was like one of the big selling points when we got to read all these plays in high school, was that, hey, there's a lot of dirty jokes in there, and there's a lot of, bawdy humor. And I think, you have to appeal to both, the wealthy people up in their boxes, and there's the queen is right up there in her box, but you also have the people standing in the standing room on the, down, and you have to appeal to them too, because
they'll throw tomatoes. They'll throw tomatoes at you. Absolutely. Like, you have people standing for 3 hours watching these plays. You have to entertain them. And I do think it's interesting that the big doubts begin so long afterwards, because I think the language evolves very rapidly. We are at equidistant from the 1700s now as they were to Shakespeare. So when you think about 200 years of language evolution, if you're reading a book from the 1700s, it can feel very dated, but it is more understandable than something from the 1500s, right? Yeah. And I think when we're reading something from the 1700s, it feels very formal and stiff. Oh, yeah. So if you're in the late 1700s reading something from the 1500s, it already sounds higher class because it sounds more formal and stiff. And I think the idea of it being in higher class language is because of distance.
Yeah. That's true. I see what you mean. So,
yeah, if we wanted to say like people who do fake Shakespeare tend to do like a very like upper class British accent. Yeah. And that's probably not how it was being delivered.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things, maybe I can even try and insert some of the audio here if I can find it. You'll see these on TikTok a lot, is people who are from the Deep South doing Shakespeare monologues.
Countryman, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. Good is often interred with their bones. It was Caesar.
So I bring that up. That is just to note from the YouTube channel, The Cultured Bumpkin. And it's referred to as this is his words, not mine.
Okay.
Redneck Mark Anthony eulogizes Julius Caesar. So I think that's worth a listen if you're interested in that kind of thing, because I think just like we have a classist feeling now about that accent, they may even felt that way about Shakespeare's Stratford accent. We don't really know.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to listen to Shakespeare delivered in different accents, because I think it destigmatizes it a little bit. I think we're so used to these like very properly English elocution people speaking Shakespeare that it gives you a very elevated idea.
Yeah.
I think especially in America, we tend to revere the British accent.
Oh yeah, there's definitely like they used a British accent in that commercial. That means it's fancy and high class.
Either it's fancy or they're the villain.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true.
Right. They're either like the worst human, because like I think like that Shakespeare villain kind of thing, like everybody's Richard III-ing around.
Yeah.
Which is, by the way, a piece of propaganda in and of itself. Richard III is extremely interesting play for that reason. But I wonder if some of it's just that kind of stereotyping is happening. But to give the denialists their due, I'm sure that there's an argument to be made for a lot of people. I've listened to them. We've had lectures here at the library about potential authorship. And I understand, too, wanting to claim Shakespeare in some way, right?
I mean, to that I'll say, well, look, he's in this literary world with other people. He's not making these in a vacuum, right? These are all created in a very specific time and place and with another group of people. And we've seen, like, you look at those Renaissance artists and it's, oh, well, this is by so-and-so. But, he had help from his students or had input from this or that. Could that have been the case here and there? Maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that, writers are highly influenced by the people around them.
Exactly.
And that there may have been, because they were performing these things, which I think is another important thing.
Yeah.
Shakespeare's artifact is very interesting because, so like years and years ago, the whole reason I got into doing these lectures at all was I had hired someone to come in and do a lecture about Shakespeare. And after the lecturer left, a woman came up to me and she says, I've just never known how to read Shakespeare. And I like looked at her and I'm like, because you're not supposed to
read, you're supposed to be watching it.
Right. Like the whole part of this is like it's oratory, it's a performance. And I think we've turned Shakespeare into a literary artifact, which is really interesting because yes, obviously plays are a part of literature.
Yeah.
But like they're really not, they're performances.
Yeah.
And I think actors giving them life means so much. By the time this comes out, it'll have passed, but PBS is airing the more recent Hamlet Shakespeare in the Park this week, which was done with an all African-American cast. And it's done with like a lot of modernisms, not in the language, but in the scene setting and everything. Yeah. And it's really good.
Cool.
I really recommend it. And I think one of the reasons that we love to do that is like it makes it feel more relevant, right?
Yeah.
And I don't really know where I'm going with this except to say that I think part of why people get traction in conspiracy theories and stuff is just like everyone wants their hand on the ball, like understandably. And I think it's so much more interesting if you're a woman to think that Shakespeare was a woman.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he kind of is up for grabs in that way.
Yeah, because there are so few, we have these gaps, we have these lack of details. So yeah.
It's this really interesting thing of reading between the lines. And I totally get it. Who doesn't want to claim Shakespeare as their own instead of this, like, realistically, probably what he was, which was upper middle class white guy with a pretty decent education for the time who fell in with the right group of people in the right moment. Because, like, you can't underestimate that, right?
Oh, yeah.
He fell in with the right people in the right time, captured the right attention, and, died without much of a record. I think it could happen in any point in history. We're recording so much right now and we think of ourselves as a mutable historical record. But if you think about all of the data that we can't access anymore already in our lifetimes,
yep.
How would you read a floppy disk now?
Oh, yeah, exactly. There's so many barriers to that right now. And yeah, we can create boundless information, but yeah, saving it can still be tricky sometimes and getting it back.
Yeah, and 500 years from now, how would you get a CD to work?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I mean, so much of our historical record is ephemeral, and it's really scary in a way to think that like there's not going to be very much record of ordinary people, and ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things.
Great motto for today's episode.
Thank you. So with all that being said, the answer to who was Shakespeare is
And that's a fair answer.
But thank you for being with me here today, Chad.
Oh, well, thanks for letting me along for the ride.
And thank you so much for your patience as we release our somewhat erratic release schedule, but we're so happy to be here talking to you. And we just want to say thank you so much for being here. Subscribe, like, leave a review on iTunes if you're so moved. And we'll talk to you again soon. And until then, read on.